Oh, I have slipped the surly bonds of earth and danced the skies on laughter-silvered wings and done 100 things you have not dreamed of. Those famous words, written over 50 years ago by a 19-year-old pilot, describe the incredible beauty and infinite changing majesty of the world in which he flew. But that world was also an arena of combat. And the young pilot who wrote of his beloved sky gave his life there, alone in his fighter, defending his country. Today, the modern military pilot faces unprecedented challenges to his competency and to his endurance. No man can truly master the skies, but each man must try. It takes a rigid discipline, constant rigorous training, courage, and pure skill to fly a modern supersonic jet fighter. Today's pilot is placed in a cockpit which contains an incredible variety of controls, switches, buttons, and digital displays. Yet if he is to fight effectively, he must be so familiar with this environment that the control of his machine becomes a natural extension of his own movements. He must become a part of his aircraft. There are very different kinds of men who fly the skies. The Air Force jock in his high-altitude, long-range interceptor. The Marine, close air support pilot, who delivers bombs and napalm to the perimeter of embattled ground units. The naval aviator, catapulting into the air from a pitching carrier deck. Each man flies a very different aircraft, each a different design. The pilot and his fighter are specialists, with weapons and tactics suited to their particular mission. And each man feels that he is the best at what he does.
That search for the best pilots, the best weapons, the best aircraft is never ending. It's consumed the dreams of aviation designers for decades. It's a tale of frustration and courage, a tale of success and failure, a journey of vision and courage that continues even to this day.
In the late 1950s, two new forces dominated fighter aircraft design: missile armament and supersonic speed. The tight, swirling dogfight of earlier years was thought to be a thing of the past. The military wanted instead to create an aircraft that would control the skies at high speed with long-range weapons. At the end of the decade, one jet emerged which combined these qualities and set the stage for the modern fighter, McDonnell Aircraft's F-4 Phantom.
The F-4H-1, developed by the McDonnell Aircraft Corporation for the United States Navy, is an advanced supersonic all-weather two-place carrier-based fighter. Primarily designed as an interceptor, 4H-1 is also capable of long-range special weapons attack.
The Phantom was just what the Navy was looking for. A jet built to fly from carriers and defend the fleet against high-speed enemies. In fact, it drew such praise for its overall performance that in 1961, on the eve of the Vietnam War, the Air Force set up a competition. Their best fighter, the F-106 Delta Dart, against the F-4 Phantom.
The F-4 was the victor. Air Force generals immediately ordered the Phantom to serve as their top dogfight aircraft, their air superiority fighter. It was a profound decision. For the first time in history, by a matter of coincidence rather than design, a single plane had the unprecedented role of premier fighter interceptor for the Air Force, Navy, and Marines. America's military forces had stumbled upon a universal fighter, just as the nation was about to go to war in Vietnam. Up until the first dogfights over Vietnam, advocates of the F-4 had been so confident of the new missile technology that the aircraft was not even armed with a traditional rapid-firing cannon. Certain that air combat would be conducted long-range at supersonic speeds, they'd also shown little concern for the Phantom's low-speed performance and maneuverability. But over Vietnam, the pilots who flew the Phantom found both of these factors to be critical in combat.
When we got into it with another jet in Vietnam, it was usually up close. They'd keep the MiGs next to the ground to fool the radar, then spring up on you. The guy was so tight on you that you couldn't take him into a supersonic fight. You just tried to maneuver for the best position. We needed a cannon or a machine gun for that kind of a fight. We also needed more agility from the aircraft. The Phantom was great at supersonic speeds, but it used up a lot of gas and could be a tough plane to handle.
Designers and engineers responded to the combat experiences of the F-4 pilots as best they could. The Phantom was retrofitted with a cannon, and some changes were made in the airframe design. The modified Phantom continued to serve all the services well, and remains active to this day. But by the mid-60s, it was clear that the government needed a whole new fighter, agile but capable of supersonic speed. At that time, development of fighter aircraft had been proceeding in two very different directions. One was a much-publicized, high-profile search for a universal fighter. The other was a project so shrouded in secrecy, the plane's existence was only acknowledged 3 full years after its first flight. The aircraft was designated the YF-12. The U.S. government, still convinced that future air combat would be supersonic, wanted the ultimate machine, faster and farther reaching than anything in the air. The requirements were incredibly demanding. A sustained altitude higher than 80,000 feet and a cruise speed in excess of Mach 3, 3 times the speed of sound. In 1960, the Lockheed Corporation responded to these challenges with a startlingly original design and won the contract for this breakthrough fighter. Getting a plane to the limits of flight required an engineering leap. Engines, ejection systems, and even a new type of fuel were created especially for the aircraft. Everything about the YF-12 was new. Heat posed perhaps the greatest challenge. The skin of an aircraft traveling at Mach 3 can reach between 600 and 700 degrees centigrade. A heat-resistant titanium shell was developed to flight performance. And special black paint to further dissipate heat and deflect radar was also developed. The aircraft was a technological wonder and appeared on the runway in a mere 22 months. But there were dangers with flight at these extremes the designers couldn't overcome. At altitudes of 60,000 and 70,000 feet, blood can boil and even evaporate. So pilots were forced, like astronauts, into cumbersome pressure suits and had to eat a special diet before flying. The aircraft's maneuverability was also limited. To reverse direction at Mach 3, the YF-12 needed to make an enormous turn of 180-mile radius. And because no sealant made could sustain the extremes of temperature the plane endured, the YF-12's tanks leaked badly on the runway and needed to be refueled almost immediately after takeoff. The drawbacks left the Air Force with an impressive high-speed jet, but one which was difficult to employ swiftly, and one whose agility was limited. Not the fighter they had hoped for. As the sacrifices for speed and altitude seemed too great, the requirement that the plane be a fighter was dropped. And in 1964, the YF-12 was converted into the SR-71 Blackbird, the world's most sophisticated reconnaissance aircraft. Though in the same year that the YF-12 was converted to reconnaissance work, a new tactical fighter bomber made its first flight. The product of an experimental program called TFX, this plane became the F-111. 3 years earlier, in February 1961, Kennedy's Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, began a competition for a single tactical fighter to serve all branches of the military. It was not an easy request. Traditionally, the Air Force and Navy had their own lines of fighters, designed and built to the demands of each service. The Navy, in particular, always faced a very specific set of challenges, operating from the deck of an aircraft carrier. A fighter designed from the ground up for both services was going to be a tall order. The fact that the F-4 was serving that role was, in the minds of most military men, a lucky coincidence. But under pressure from McNamara, who felt the move would be cost-effective, they agreed to proceed. In November of 1962, the winning design, the General Dynamics F-111, was announced. Ironically enough, the task of producing the F-111 was quickly divided along service lines. General Dynamics would build the Air Force's F-111A, and Grumman, a longtime Navy contractor, would handle the Navy's F-111B. 2 years later, the first of the new experimental fighters was ready. On December 21st, 1964, with much fanfare, the Air Force's F-111A took to the skies for the first time. At the time, the F-111 was at the cutting edge of design. It was the first production line fighter to successfully employ swing wings, a feature which greatly enhanced the plane's maneuverability and rate of turn. It also made use of a new capsule-like ejection system, which returned the two-man crew safely to land or sea in an unprecedentedly wide range of circumstances. And its terrain-following radar system guided the plane as it skimmed along the Earth at extremely low altitude and at supersonic speeds. It made the aircraft an effective weapon with which to penetrate enemy radar, day or night, in any weather. In the spring of 1968, a squadron of F-111As were deployed in Thailand for testing and use in the Vietnam War. Despite the many advantages, the plane proved inadequate under combat conditions. Pilots, especially fighter pilots, were disappointed with characteristics of the aircraft. A simple thing like seat arrangement had profound repercussions on the aircraft's effectiveness.
For one thing, the F-111 has a side-by-side cockpit. The visibility out of it is very poor in a fighter environment. Seems like a simple thing, but in a dogfight, you have to be able to see all around you. In an F-111, the pilot can't see behind him at all, and he's got to depend on the radar officer beside him to tell what's happening on the other side of the aircraft. In the heat of air-to-air combat, a thing like that makes you extremely vulnerable.
To this day, the F-111 remains in service as an important Air Force fighter bomber, having served most recently in the American bombing raid on Libya. But the plane never fulfilled the Air Force's hopes as a pure fighter. At the end of the 1960s, they were still searching. While the F-111A did meet some of the Air Force's needs, the F-111B did not satisfy the Navy at all. 7 prototypes were put through tests under a variety of conditions to determine the plane's suitability for carrier use. The drama played out over months, on both land and sea. In the end, the F-111B was rejected. The plane proved too heavy for carrier use. Compromises to permit its use by both services had resulted in an unacceptable machine for the Navy. Congress and the Department of Defense were frustrated by the Navy's rejection of the plane. A universal fighter had been a popular idea, and costs for the development of the F-111 had run into the billions. The modern fighter, supersonic and missile-armed, but still facing a host of challenges, was at a crossroads.
With the demise of the F-111B, it might seem that the dream of the all-purpose universal fighter had proven useless. A footnote to aviation history. Well, not so. For out of that extraordinary effort came a realization that not only may variety be the spice of life, in such diversity, we may find our very survival. And so the game plan for the next generation of fighters was defined. To do one thing especially well, to be the best in a deadly arena where only the very best can survive. These were the rules of that game. The fighter was ready to enter the modern age.
The Navy responded to the failure of the F-111B swiftly. They commissioned Grumman to design a fighter with a single purpose. That purpose was to defend the fleet against threats from the air. Building upon the experience of F-4 pilots in Vietnam and the lessons of the F-111, they developed a pure air-to-air long-range fighter with no role as an air-to-ground attack aircraft. Throughout the design and test phases, specialization was the goal. The perceived need to tailor an aircraft for a particular role, to make it mission-specific, defined the course of modern fighter design. It also resulted in the best naval interceptor in the world, the F-14 Tomcat.
With the F-14, all our training is air-to-air. We got one job to do, and that's protect the fleet from incoming enemy aircraft. We train for a certain amount of escort work, but we're really up there to keep the enemy away from our ships. And the F-14 is a plane that's optimally designed for this. With the variable geometry wing, A Tomcat can outturn any fighter flying today. It's highly maneuverable. I can do things in this I'd never dreamed of in an F-4. One feature they retain from the F-4 is the two-seat cockpit. The radar and weapons information moving through the aircraft is enormous. Plus, it's coupled with additional data you get from the E-2C Hawkeye. No single pilot could handle it and fly the plane at the same time. That's why you got your backseater, the radar intercept officer. The two of you work together with the Hawkeye to determine the nature of the threat and the best way to respond. With the Tomcat, it's all about teamwork. But the heart of the F-14 is really the Phoenix weapons system. Nobody else has got it. It gives us unequaled ability to stop the enemy before he's close. It's called standoff capability. Coupled with the other weapons we carry, Sparrows and Sidewinders, we can respond to threats from right in close to long range. The Phoenix is a multiple-target, multiple-warhead missile system with a fire and forget capability. That means we can fire at up to 6 targets at a great distance, and each missile will independently direct itself to the target. With some other weapon systems, you have to stick with the enemy until he's been hit. We can get out of there as soon as we've launched.
When the Air Force looked for a replacement for the F-4, they followed the path the Navy had with the Tomcat. They chose to specialize. They wanted a pure air-to-air fighter. Not a pound for air-to-ground was their slogan. This jet was to be a dogfighter in the classic sense. A plane that could be flown by a single pilot, head-to-head against any airborne adversary. The ultimate air superiority fighter. The search ended with an aircraft that met all these wishes. The McDonnell Douglas F-15 Eagle.
The F-15 is a simpler plane to fly than the F-4, but it's still a complex machine. It's got more than 300 dials, bells, buzzers, lights, and switches. The advantage is the arrangement. Everything's on your heads-up display, and the switches are either on the throttle or the stick. With the F-4 switchology, you have to reach around and look down on all sorts of stuff. With the F-15, you just look and shoot.
Of all the services, the Marine Corps has perhaps the most distinctive missions for its close support aircraft. The Corps' traditional role in invasion demands a versatile frontline aircraft with a strong ground support capability. By the height of the Vietnam War, it was clear that what the Marines needed was a fixed-wing aircraft with the qualities of a helicopter. And in 1968, at the Farnborough Air Show outside London, a revolutionary new British aircraft with just those qualities caught the eye of Marine Corps Colonel Tom Miller. It was the Harrier, an airplane which could take off and land like a helicopter and fly and fight like a jet. Miller immediately saw the Harrier as the answer to the Marines' needs. The Corps had a hard time convincing Congress to support the purchase of an aircraft of foreign design, but a compromise was reached. Production of the American Harrier became a joint venture of British Aerospace and McDonnell Douglas. Today, the Harrier is a fundamental element in the tactical operations of the United States Marines.
On top of its strong attack capabilities, the Harrier can operate from the full range of sights the Marines require. That's its real advantage. You can fly from ships at sea, regular airstrips, and what we call remote sights. The plane works by directing the thrust of its engines. With the takeoff ability that this thrust vectoring gives you, all you need is 1,000 feet of road or grass strip for a short takeoff and a small clearing for a vertical one. Other aircraft require a well-maintained strip of 8,000 to 10,000 feet. Right now, we can operate Harriers within 15 miles of the lines with almost all the weapons of the top attack aircraft that require an airstrip or carrier deck. Communications with ground forces are easy and immediate. It makes the Harrier a very versatile weapon. Though it's primarily an attack aircraft, the Harrier is also a strong air-to-air fighter. The American versions are designed for close-range fights. In tight, the agility of the aircraft and the maneuverability that thrust vectoring gives you make the Harrier a pretty tricky dogfighter. We can practically stop on a dime. To be honest, radar-equipped fighters have a real advantage on us in long-range situations. We have to get in close and slow the fight down to be really effective. Once we're there, though, we can give anybody a tough time.
By the early 1970s, the cost of a single fighter approached $50 million. And technological advances had galloped past what was already invested in the F-14, F-15, and Harrier. Both the Navy and the Air Force felt the need for an inexpensive fighter that would incorporate the latest innovations and complement the Tomcat and the Eagle. They also wanted to simplify their aircraft, to reduce the number of tasks required of a pilot. The Navy in particular needed to establish a single-seat strike fighter. The two planes that emerged from this process, the Navy and Marine Corps' FA-18 Hornet and the Air Force's F-16 Falcon, represent the state-of-the-art in aircraft performance.
The F-16's so slick it practically outperforms the pilot. With the computer-controlled flight systems, the plane will do virtually anything you ask of it in the way of climbing and maneuvering. It's a joy to fly. But it's every bit as physically demanding as the older jets. Even more. High G-loads have been commonplace since the jet age, but with the Falcon, you've got a plane that can routinely work around 7 Gs and go up as high as 9. That means your arm is 7 to 9 times its normal weight. What actually happens in that region is that you black out. You're trained to grunt to reduce the loss of blood from your brain, but the aircraft will perform so well for so long that in a matter of seconds the pilot's unconscious and unable to fly. The military is now researching ways of limiting the G-force on the pilots.
In addition to the physical demands that today's pilots face, there are tremendous mental challenges. Pilots work with complex weapons and radar systems that require extensive and sophisticated knowledge of their own capabilities and their enemies.
It's a kind of a paradox, but even though the new jets are more complex than the old F-4s, they're easier to fly. But that doesn't mean you've got a lot of free time. The pilot's attention's been shifted to other areas. Things happen so fast when two planes are approaching one another at over 1,000 miles an hour that you've got to identify the enemy and know what he's capable of instantly. You can't think about flying the plane. It has to be almost an extension of your own body. The onboard flight control computers and high-performance electronics of these new aircraft make that easier than ever. You're freed up to concentrate on the fight itself, and you need all the mental energy you can muster. The modern fighter demands as much from the pilot mentally as it does physically. Different planes are better at different kinds of fights. F-15s and F-14s have weapons in them that could knock an F-16 or an FA-18 out before we ever saw them. They're dedicated long-range interceptors. We've got a fighter role too, but we also have a role in air-to-ground attack, and we're smaller and lighter. Our air fight is best fairly close. If we can get within 25 miles of one of those planes, of any plane, we'll probably get them. I don't think anyone can touch us.
That formidable array of aircraft were in place the world over by the beginning of the 1980s. But they had yet to face the ultimate challenge, head-to-head combat with a real adversary. Pilots accumulate hours of training under every imaginable condition. The edge must be kept sharp, waiting in constant readiness for the moment of truth. The moment they eagerly await and quietly dread, that will come only when they take to the skies to fight other men in other machines.
Preparation for combat begins with intensive training on a single aircraft. Pilots review the capabilities of their jets and rehearse combat scenarios in carefully controlled exercises designed to hone specific skills.
One of the first things they had us do in the F-14 was to go up against the T-38. It's a small, extremely maneuverable fighter, very tight turning. The point of the hop was defensive maneuvering, how to get out of a defensive position and into an offensive one. We started in the worst possible position. The T-38 was directly behind us on our 6 o'clock. The way it worked is that we went over what we do in the classroom, then executed it in a real situation. In this case, we used superior power to break away from the T-38, climb up, and then turn down on him. It went perfectly. By the time we got around, we completely reversed the situation, and we're right on his tail.
The next level of challenge is unrehearsed air combat maneuvering. Individual pilots are pitted head-to-head. In this hop, the F-18 Hornet goes against the F-15 Eagle. Once the fight is on, each pilot struggles like a wrestler for the advantage. Tactics, knowledge of his opponent's aircraft, and sheer tenacity all come into play. It is a brief, intense, and physically exhausting ordeal. This is the perspective from the cockpit of an F-15.
3,000, lights on. Off the wing. Control there. Airspeed there. You did essentially a level turn there. Get that nose up there. I think I can do it. If I can kill, knock it off. Roger, knock it off.
But while such one-on-one maneuvers challenge a pilot's skill, they fall short of the experience of combat in one respect: multiple aircraft. Pilots are never in the air alone, and air combat usually involves several aircraft. The true test comes in multiple engagements with multiple aircraft. This test, the ultimate challenge, puts both aircraft and pilot to the limit of their capacities. Short of actual combat, it is as demanding a situation as any of these men will ever face.
It may be that someday in the future, aviation designers will provide us with the perfect all-purpose fighter. Perhaps. But until that day, we will rely on the diversity of our specialized aircraft to meet the myriad demands of modern air combat. It's the ability to meet those demands, to respond quickly to each maneuver with the right weapon in the right place at the right time, that will allow us to prevail. In bringing together the diverse capabilities of all our fighter aircraft and blending them into a complete coordinated force in battle, we can achieve a goal that is essential to victory. A goal we have ultimately never failed to accomplish when challenged. Control of the skies, supremacy in the air.